"We heard about what you did yesterday," one of them said, stopping a few feet away. "Gave your only horse to that Apache woman? You're crazy." The cowboy shrugged, sipping his coffee. "She needed it," he said simply. "I couldn't leave her there." "But she's an Apache," another rancher said, frowning. "And we've had trouble with them before." That could have been dangerous. The cowboy didn't argue. He knew the risks. He had weighed them carefully before acting. But some things couldn't be measured in safety or danger. "I just did what I had to do," he said. No more, no less. The ranchers shook their heads but didn't press further. They left muttering among themselves, leaving the cowboy alone with his thoughts once again. The plains were silent now except for the occasional bird call or the faint sound of the wind through the sagebrush. He felt a strange mix of pride and worry. Pride because he had done what he believed was right. Worry because he had no idea how the woman was faring or what might happen next. Meanwhile, miles away, the Apache woman struggled through the uneven ground, leaning heavily on the horse. Her injuries were serious, but the gift of the horse had given her a chance she would not have had on foot. Each step of the horse made her flinch, pain shooting through her body, but she gritted her teeth and held on. She had a family, a community waiting for her, and she knew she could not let herself falter. The horse moved steadily, guided by her trembling hands, and she used the blanket the cowboy had given her to support her wounds. She whispered prayers softly, asking for guidance and for the strength to survive. Her thoughts were a mixture of fear and hope. She knew the plains were dangerous, filled with wild animals, harsh terrain, and the possibility of hostile strangers. But the kindness of the cowboy had given her something she had not expected, a chance to live. As the morning wore on, the woman reached a small stream. She carefully dismounted, resting the horse while drinking from the clear, cold water. She had to stop frequently, every movement sending sharp pains through her body, but she refused to give in to despair. She knew that the journey ahead would be long, but the horse carried her safely, allowing her to move faster than she ever could have on her own. Back at the ranch, the cowboy finished his breakfast and began preparing for a day of chores, yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman. He couldn't help but think about the dangers she might face and the kindness he had shown her. His neighbors would likely never understand why he had done it, but that didn't matter. He knew that in a world filled with fear and hostility, small acts of compassion were rare, and sometimes they made all the difference. Throughout the day, he went about his work, checking fences, feeding the livestock, and repairing a gate that had been damaged during a recent storm. But even as he worked, he imagined her journey across the plains. He pictured her face, pale and tired yet determined, holding on tightly to the horse as they moved together. Each thought made him feel a deep connection to someone he had never known, a human bond created through a simple act of kindness. By mid-afternoon, the cowboy decided to take a walk along a ridge that overlooked the valley below. From there, he could see the vast expanse of the plains stretching endlessly in every direction. He imagined the woman riding through that same landscape, the sun beating down on her back, the wind in her hair, and he hoped she was finding her way. The idea that he had been able to help even in such a small way filled him with a quiet sense of purpose. At the same time, the woman continued her journey, relying on the horse and her own determination. She moved carefully, aware that one wrong step could cause her to fall or worsen her injuries. She thought about the cowboy, wondering why he had risked so much to help someone he didn't know. His generosity seemed almost impossible in a world that often rewarded cruelty over kindness. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the horse, but for the faith he had shown in her, a faith she could not forget. As the day wore on, the woman reached a small cluster of trees that offered some shade and shelter. She tied the horse to a sturdy branch, letting it graze on the sparse grass while she tended to her wounds as best she could. She cleaned the cuts with water from her canteen and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. Her movements were slow and careful, but her resolve remained strong. She knew that rest was temporary. She had to continue moving to survive. The cowboy, meanwhile, returned to his cabin as the sun dipped lower in the sky. He lit a small fire outside and began preparing a simple dinner, though his appetite was small. His mind remained focused on the woman, imagining her struggle and hoping that she was safe for the night. The stars began to appear one by one in the sky, and he felt a strange connection between the vast expanse above and the small figure he had helped out there somewhere. That evening, he noticed movement along a distant ridge. At first he thought it was a coyote or a fox, but as he watched, he realized it was something larger. He squinted, trying to see more clearly, but the distance made it impossible. He felt a pang of worry, wondering if it could be the woman returning somehow or if danger had found her. He couldn't tell, and the uncertainty weighed on him. The night grew colder, and the cowboy wrapped himself in a blanket, sitting close to the fire. He reflected on the choices he had made, knowing that compassion often came with risk. He thought about the woman, imagining her courage, and realized that survival often depended as much on the kindness of others as it did on strength or skill. That thought stayed with him long after the fire had died down. Meanwhile, the woman rested under the trees, listening to the sounds of the night. The plains were alive with movement, the calls of nocturnal creatures echoing through the darkness. She felt the horse shift beside her, and she stroked its neck gently, grateful for its steady presence. Her body ached, but her spirit remained unbroken. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to the cowboy, whose act had given her the chance to continue, and she promised herself that she would not let his kindness be in vain. In the early hours of the next morning, she prepared to continue her journey. The first light of dawn painted the horizon with pale pinks and blues, and she felt a renewed sense of determination. She mounted the horse carefully, making sure her wounds were supported, and set off again across the plains. Each step was slow and deliberate, but the horse carried her steadily forward. She knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but she felt hope for the first time since her injuries. Back at the cabin, the cowboy woke with the sun, the events of the previous day still heavy on his mind. He worked quietly, tending to the animals and preparing for the day, yet he could not shake the image of the woman riding through the plains. He felt a deep sense of connection to someone he had never truly known, bound by a single act of courage and compassion. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, and the cowboy realized that his small act of kindness had created ripples far beyond what he could see. Somewhere out there, a woman rode on his horse, alive and determined, and that thought gave him a quiet sense of satisfaction. He understood that the world was unpredictable and harsh, but it was also capable of extraordinary moments of human connection. As the day wore on, he felt a subtle change within himself. The act of helping the woman had reminded him of the importance of compassion, of looking beyond fear and risk to do what was right. The plains could be harsh and unforgiving, but they were also a place where courage, kindness, and humanity could thrive. And in that thought, he found a kind of peace, knowing that even the smallest gestures could have powerful consequences. The woman, miles away, continued her journey, each step bringing her closer to safety. She relied on the horse, on her own strength, and on the quiet hope that someone had believed in her when she could not believe in herself. The plains were vast and dangerous, but they also held the possibility of survival, of human connection, and of unexpected kindness. By evening, the cowboy once again sat outside his cabin, staring at the horizon. He thought about the woman, wondering if she had made it through the day safely. He felt a mixture of worry and hope, knowing that life was unpredictable, but believing that compassion could change outcomes in ways that were impossible to predict. The plains stretched endlessly before him, and he realized that the story was far from over. Something significant had begun the day he chose to help, and he had a feeling that it would not end until the plains themselves had told the tale. And as night fell, with stars scattered across the dark sky, the cowboy felt a quiet resolve. He had acted from the heart, and that choice had already set events in motion that neither he nor anyone else could have imagined. Somewhere out there, a woman rode on his horse, alive because of him, and he understood that sometimes courage was not about fighting or defending, but about choosing to care when the world seemed harsh and unforgiving. The morning light spread slowly across the plains, touching every ridge and valley with a warm glow. The cowboy was awake before dawn, sitting outside his small cabin and staring at the horizon. His mind was restless, filled with thoughts of the woman he had helped. He could not forget her face, pale and worn, and the quiet determination she had shown as she rode his horse across the endless plains. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the jagged hills of the western plains, casting long golden shadows across the dry, dusty ground. A lone cowboy rode his only horse, the animal's hooves kicking up small clouds of dirt as they moved steadily along a narrow trail. The cowboy was lean, with weathered skin and eyes that had seen more harsh days than he cared to remember. His clothes were simple, worn from long days of work under the scorching sun, and his hat sat low over his forehead, shielding his eyes from the fading light. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the faint smoke from distant campfires, a reminder that the open plains were never truly empty. He had been traveling all day, checking the scattered herds and making sure nothing had gone astray. The plains were quiet now, quieter than usual, and the cowboy felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Something about the stillness made him tighten his grip on the reins. As he rode, his horse snorted softly, ears twitching as if it sensed something unusual in the distance. Then far off near the edge of a small, rocky hill, the cowboy saw a figure. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow stretching and moving with the wind. But as he looked closer, he realized it was a woman. She was crawling along the ground, moving painfully, each motion slow and laborious. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted and dusty, and blood had dried on her arm. She looked tiny and fragile against the vast open landscape. The cowboy's first instinct was caution. He knew the tension that existed between settlers and the Apache in this region. Many people in the towns around had told stories, some true, some exaggerated, of warriors attacking and taking revenge. He had learned to be wary of strangers, especially those who seemed out of place. But as he watched the woman struggle, another feeling rose stronger than fear: compassion. He slowed his horse to a gentle walk, keeping a careful distance. He could see her wince with every movement, her face pale and drawn with pain. She had clearly been injured for some time, and she seemed unable to move quickly or even stand. The cowboy's mind raced. If he didn't help her, she might not survive until morning. But helping her could be dangerous. Even a simple act of kindness could be misunderstood in these tense times. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to ride past her. He called out softly, his voice carrying over the wind.
"Hey, you all right?"
The woman froze at first, then slowly looked up, her eyes wide with fear and pain. The cowboy noticed how tired she looked, how every movement seemed to cost her strength. She didn't respond, only letting out a weak, rasping breath. The cowboy dismounted carefully, tying his horse to a nearby rock. He approached her slowly, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. He crouched down beside her, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just need to help you get through this." She flinched, her body tensing as if expecting an attack. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that comes from knowing people could be cruel and that trust could be dangerous. He searched her for injuries. Her arm was cut and bleeding, and she had a deep bruise along her side. She was clearly exhausted, and the cowboy realized that she couldn't walk far without collapsing. He thought about his horse, strong and steady, the only one he had, but he also knew that if she couldn't move, she might not survive. The decision came quickly in his mind, almost instinctively. He couldn't leave her here. He spoke softly again. "I'm going to help you. You're going to need my horse to get out of here." Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment he thought she might scream or try to run, but she was too weak. She nodded slightly, a gesture of cautious acceptance. He unbuckled his saddle and helped her onto the horse, careful not to jostle her too much. She clung to the saddle, trembling, her eyes scanning the plains as if expecting danger at every turn. The cowboy adjusted the reins and offered her some water from his canteen. She drank slowly, her hands shaking, and he watched silently. He could feel the tension in his chest, the mix of worry and resolve. He knew he was taking a risk, giving away his only means of fast travel, his only companion for long days across the plains. But there was no hesitation in his heart. This was the right thing to do. He stayed with her for a while, letting her regain some strength. He asked her where she was hurt and what had happened, but she didn't speak, only shaking her head. He didn't press. Words weren't needed. Her condition spoke volumes. The cowboy gathered what little supplies he had, some dried meat, a bit of water, and a small blanket. He handed them to her, making sure she had everything she might need for the immediate journey. The wind blew across the plain, carrying the scent of wildflowers and dry earth. The cowboy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He could imagine the stories that would spread later. A cowboy helping an Apache woman, risking everything. Some would praise him, others would call him foolish. But right now, all that mattered was her life. He mounted another small ridge to survey the land, trying to choose a path that would be safest for her. There were rocky outcrops, hidden ravines, and the potential for wild animals. The cowboy knew the land like the back of his hand, and he picked a route that would be less exposed, though slower. He guided the horse carefully, making sure she was balanced and secure. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the plains, and the air turned cooler. The woman shivered, and the cowboy offered his coat. She hesitated, then took it, holding it tightly around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but it bridged the silent gap between them. He didn't need words to understand the gratitude in her eyes. Night was approaching, and the cowboy knew he couldn't stay with her all night. He had to return to his ranch, where he was expected, and he also needed to keep an eye on his own safety. But leaving her alone, even with the horse, would be hard. He reassured her, speaking softly, "You're strong. You'll make it. Follow this path and you'll find help soon." She nodded, her lips trembling slightly, and for the first time, she allowed a faint smile. The cowboy mounted his horse, feeling the emptiness of the moment. His companion, his only horse, was now with her, and he would have to walk back. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky in shades of red and purple. He looked at her one last time before turning away, watching her disappear slowly into the shadows of the plain. She rode steadily, her figure growing smaller, and he whispered a silent prayer for her safety. As he walked back to the town, he thought about the choices he had made. People might call him foolish, some might never understand, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had done what he thought was right, and sometimes that was enough. The plains were wide and unforgiving, but they also held moments of unexpected kindness. That night he returned to his small cabin, exhausted but restless. He kept thinking about the woman, wondering if she would make it, if someone would find her, if she would survive the night. He realized that helping someone in need often meant taking risks, and that courage wasn't always about facing danger head-on. Sometimes it was about choosing to care when it was easier to look away. As the stars appeared one by one in the dark sky, he sat quietly outside, listening to the distant calls of coyotes and the rustling of the wind through the dry grass. His thoughts were with her, the wounded woman who had ridden off into the unknown on his horse. He knew that the story was far from over, and that the plains often had surprises in store. He felt a strange mix of fear and hope, knowing that whatever happened next, he had acted from the heart. Deep down, he also felt a change within himself. The plains had always been a place of hard work and survival, but tonight he realized they could also be a place of connection, where the choices of one person could ripple far beyond what anyone imagined. And somewhere out there, a woman rode on his horse, alive because he had chosen to act, and that thought gave him a sense of peace he had not felt in years. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, the cowboy finally went inside to rest, though sleep came only fitfully. He dreamed of the plains, of the wind, and of a figure on a horse riding steadily through the night. And as he drifted in and out of sleep, he felt certain that this was only the beginning of a story that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others in ways he could not yet see. The morning sun rose slowly over the plains, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. The cowboy had already been awake for hours, sitting outside his cabin and staring at the horizon. His mind kept drifting back to the woman he had helped the day before. The plains were wide and empty, but somehow, he could still picture her figure on his horse, fragile yet determined. He wondered if she had managed to find water, if she was hiding safely, or if she had encountered any danger along the way. He had shared this story with no one yet. Some neighbors would have called him reckless, others brave. But the cowboy didn't think of it as either. He had acted out of simple compassion, a need to help someone in pain. He knew that even small gestures could carry enormous consequences, some he could not foresee. And he had a feeling that this act, small as it seemed, would ripple far beyond that dusty plain. While he prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and bread, he noticed a group of local ranchers walking along the dirt road toward him. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. He wondered if she had found water, if she had rested, if she had reached the safety of her people. The day was quiet, but the quiet was heavy. The cowboy went about his chores, feeding the animals and repairing a fence that had been broken by a recent storm. Yet, no matter what he did, his thoughts kept returning to her. He had given away his only horse, the one companion that had carried him safely across the plains for years. But that thought was not filled with regret. It was filled with hope. He had done what he knew was right, and he felt a quiet strength in that choice. Meanwhile, miles away, the woman continued her journey. The horse carried her steadily, And although her body ached with every movement, she refused to stop for long. She knew that staying in one place could be dangerous. The plains were full of hidden threats, from wild animals to hostile strangers. She thought of the cowboy, wondering why he had helped her, why he had trusted her when the world often seemed cruel. His kindness felt almost impossible in a place so harsh, but it had given her hope and strength. She paused briefly at a small grove of trees, tying the horse to a sturdy branch so it could graze. She knelt to tend to her wounds as best she could, washing the cuts with water from her canteen and covering them with pieces of cloth she had carefully torn from her clothing. Every movement caused pain, but she breathed through it, reminding herself that each step forward brought her closer to safety. The horse shifted under her touch, nuzzling her gently as if it sensed her exhaustion. She rested for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the plains. The wind whispered through the tall grass and distant birds called from the trees. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to return home, to be surrounded by her family and community, safe from harm. The thought lifted her spirits, giving her the courage to continue. Back at the cabin, the cowboy's day moved slowly. The townspeople had begun talking about what he had done, some with admiration, some with disbelief. A few had come by to warn him, saying that helping an Apache woman could bring trouble. He listened politely but said nothing. He had no need to explain himself. He had acted from the heart, and that was enough. As afternoon approached, he noticed movement on the ridge near his cabin. At first, he thought it might be a coyote or a lone traveler, but the shapes grew larger and more defined. His stomach tightened. Something was coming. He watched carefully, scanning the horizon. A group of figures appeared, moving steadily toward him. There were more than 50, perhaps 70. They were warriors dressed in traditional clothing, their faces painted, their weapons visible even from a distance. The cowboy's mind raced. He had never seen this many Apache warriors together. Fear tightened his chest, and he instinctively reached for the empty space where his horse would normally be. He had no horse now, only his own 2 feet and the small rifle at his side. The reality of his situation hit him sharply. He was alone, surrounded by a group of people who had every reason to see him as an enemy. The warriors moved with precision, their steps silent yet deliberate. The cowboy could feel their eyes on him, measuring him, watching his every movement. He raised his hand slowly, showing no aggression, hoping to convey that he meant no harm. His heart pounded in his chest, and he forced himself to stay calm. Fear could be seen in the smallest movements, and he could not afford to show weakness. The leader of the group stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. The cowboy squinted, trying to understand the meaning behind the gesture. He could see that the warrior was older, with a calm authority in his movements. The others waited silently, their attention focused on the cowboy. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. For a long moment, neither side moved. The cowboy could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions, the uncertainty. Then slowly, the leader spoke. The words were in Apache, and the cowboy did not understand them, but the tone was not hostile. The warrior gestured toward the plains, toward the east where the woman had likely traveled. The cowboy realized with a mix of relief and astonishment that they knew about her, and more importantly, they knew about him. The cowboy kept his hands raised, nodding slowly. He did not speak, but he wanted them to know he had acted with no intention of harm. The leader stepped closer, his gaze steady. Then one by one, the other warriors began moving forward, surrounding the cowboy, not in aggression but in acknowledgement. They did not raise their weapons. They did not attack. The cowboy felt a mixture of fear and wonder. He had expected anger, perhaps even revenge, but what he saw was something entirely different. The leader reached into a bag and pulled out small gifts, dried meat, a few blankets, and other supplies. He placed them on the ground in front of the cowboy, bowing slightly. The gesture was clear. They were showing gratitude. The cowboy's mouth went dry. He had never expected this. In his mind, he had imagined punishment, but not respect, not this acknowledgement of his kindness. The woman had told them about him. The leader explained through gestures and expressions. She had spoken of his courage, his willingness to risk everything to save her. The cowboy felt a warmth in his chest, a quiet affirmation that even in a world filled with fear and hostility, acts of kindness could create bonds that nothing else could. The warriors stayed with him for some time, sharing food and water, their movements calm and measured. The cowboy noticed the subtle signs of trust, the way they allowed him to remain in the center, the way they spoke to each other without fear. He realized that this moment was extraordinary. A single act of compassion had transformed the dynamic between them, creating a connection that might never have existed otherwise. As the sun began to descend, painting the plains in shades of gold and orange, the leader gestured for the cowboy to follow. They moved together toward a small cluster of trees, where the woman had likely sought shelter the previous day. The cowboy followed, careful to respect their space and customs. He felt a mix of curiosity and nervousness, unsure of what to expect. When they reached the clearing, the woman appeared, riding the horse steadily despite her injuries. She looked at the cowboy, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The plains seemed to hold their breath. Then slowly, the woman dismounted, walking toward the cowboy with a smile. She nodded in gratitude, a gesture that carried more weight than words could convey. The cowboy felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He had feared the worst, imagined danger and retaliation, but what he saw was humanity in its purest form. The woman had survived, and the warriors had shown gratitude and respect. The plains, harsh and unforgiving as they were, had become a place where courage and kindness could create change. The woman spoke softly to the leader, gesturing toward the cowboy. He watched silently, realizing that her words were full of praise, telling them of his selfless act. The leader nodded, acknowledging the truth of her account. The other warriors shifted, some bowing slightly, others simply watching, but all with a quiet respect that the cowboy had never expected. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken understanding. The cowboy realized that his fear had been replaced by connection, that the risks he had taken had led to something extraordinary. He thought about the plains, about the long days he had spent riding alone, and he understood that life often offered moments of clarity in the most unexpected ways. The warriors began to move again, offering the cowboy gifts as tokens of their appreciation. They presented him with a horse strong and healthy, along with supplies for travel. The gesture was more than generosity. It was a sign of trust, a bridge built between two worlds that had often been in conflict. The cowboy accepted the gifts humbly, understanding their significance and the bond that had been formed. The woman, now resting safely nearby, looked at him with gratitude and quiet admiration. The cowboy felt a deep connection to her, a bond created not by words but by shared experience, risk, and compassion. The plains had been the stage for this story, and in that vast open space, a remarkable event had taken place, one that would be remembered long after the sun had set. As night fell, the cowboy, the woman, and the warriors gathered around a fire. The flames cast long shadows across their faces, highlighting the lines of age, hardship, and resilience. They shared food and water, stories and laughter, forming a moment of unity that seemed impossible just a day before. The plains, which could be harsh and unforgiving, had become a place of connection, understanding, and respect. The cowboy sat quietly, reflecting on the events of the day. He had acted out of compassion, and in doing so, he had created bonds that might never have existed otherwise. The woman had survived, and the warriors had recognized the courage in his actions. It was a lesson in humanity, one that transcended fear, conflict, and prejudice. The night grew colder, and the stars appeared in the clear sky above. The cowboy felt a quiet peace, knowing that he had done what was right. Somewhere in the vast plains, a single act of kindness had created a ripple, one that had brought together people who might otherwise have remained strangers, even enemies. He understood that the plains held both danger and beauty, cruelty and generosity, and that life was often shaped by the choices one made in moments of uncertainty. And as he sat by the fire, listening to the wind and the quiet voices around him, the cowboy realized that this story was far from over. The plains had more to teach, and the bonds that had been formed today would continue to grow in ways he could not yet see. Courage, he understood, was not just in facing danger. It was in choosing to act with kindness, even when the world seemed harsh and unforgiving. The plains were quiet that morning, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The cowboy woke early, stretching his tired muscles and looking toward the horizon. The events of the previous day had left him with a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. He had never imagined that an act of kindness could lead to something so extraordinary. The Apache warriors had not only accepted him, but they had also honored his choice to help the woman. It was a moment that defied everything he had been taught about fear, conflict, and survival. The woman sat nearby, tending to the horse and her own wounds. She moved carefully, each step measured, but her eyes held a quiet determination. She spoke softly to the horse, murmuring words of encouragement, and the cowboy watched her with a mix of admiration and concern. She had endured so much, yet she carried herself with grace and courage that few could imagine. He felt a deep respect for her, a bond formed not through words but through shared experience and survival. The warriors were already awake, preparing for the day. They moved with purpose, their gestures precise, their actions calm. The cowboy observed them quietly, noticing the way they respected each other, the way they worked together without need for commands. There was a harmony in their movements, a unity that spoke of years of shared struggle and trust. He realized that this was a society built on understanding, courage, and loyalty, values that were often missing from the world he had known. As the sun rose higher, the leader approached the cowboy. He gestured for him to come closer, and the cowboy complied, moving carefully. The leader pointed to the horse, then to the supplies they had brought the day before, and finally to the horizon. The message was clear. They wanted him to understand the depth of their gratitude. They were not simply acknowledging his act. They were honoring it, showing that one gesture of compassion could resonate far beyond the moment it was made. The cowboy nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He had never expected such recognition, never imagined that helping someone in need could lead to this. Yet as he looked around, he saw the sincerity in their eyes, the quiet dignity in their gestures. He understood that they were offering him something far more valuable than material gifts. They were offering trust, respect, and acknowledgement of his humanity. The woman approached, her movements careful but deliberate. She looked at the cowboy and then at the warriors, her expression one of deep gratitude. She gestured toward the plains, indicating the journey she had taken and the risks she had faced. The cowboy listened silently, realizing that her words, though he did not understand them, carried the weight of truth and courage. She had survived because of him, and now, through her, the warriors were honoring that survival. One of the warriors stepped forward, carrying a small bundle. He placed it at the cowboy's feet and gestured for him to open it. Inside were items of great value, finely crafted tools, a well-made blanket, and a small amount of dried meat. The gifts were humble, yet their significance was immense. They were symbols of gratitude, of acknowledgement, and of a bond that had been forged through courage and compassion. The cowboy felt a deep sense of humility. He had acted without expectation, driven only by the need to help someone in distress. Yet here he was, being recognized and honored in a way he had never imagined. He realized that kindness, even in its simplest form, had the power to bridge worlds, to create connections that fear and prejudice could never break. The woman spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. She gestured toward the cowboy, then toward the warriors, and finally toward the horizon. The message was clear. His act had not only saved her life, but had also brought honor and recognition to all of them. The cowboy nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had acted out of compassion, and now that compassion had created a ripple that extended far beyond what he could see. The warriors began to move, forming a circle around the cowboy and the woman. Their movements were deliberate, their expressions calm and focused. The leader stepped forward, raising his hand in a gesture that was both ceremonial and respectful. The cowboy felt a mixture of awe and humility. He had never been part of anything like this, never experienced a moment so profound in its simplicity and its meaning. One by one, the warriors knelt or bowed slightly, offering gestures of respect and acknowledgement. They placed their hands over their hearts, then extended them toward the cowboy, a sign of gratitude that transcended language. The cowboy's chest tightened with emotion. He had acted from the heart, without expectation of reward or recognition, and yet here was a community honoring him in a way that words could never fully capture. The woman watched quietly, her eyes reflecting the firelight and the warmth of the moment. She had survived because of his courage, and now she was witnessing the unthinkable, 70 warriors, each one acknowledging the bravery and kindness of a stranger. The plains, harsh and unforgiving as they were, had become a stage for a moment of humanity that would be remembered long after the fire had died. The leader spoke again, using gestures and expressions to convey meaning. He indicated that the cowboy's actions had strengthened the bond between their people, that his courage and compassion had not gone unnoticed. The cowboy listened, understanding the essence of the message even if the words were foreign. He realized that trust, respect, and humanity could transcend language, culture, and fear. The warriors remained with him for hours, sharing stories through gestures, offering food and water, and showing the cowboy the depth of their gratitude. He felt a profound connection to each of them, a bond that had been forged not through conflict or negotiation, but through simple acts of courage and compassion. The plains, which had often seemed vast and lonely, were now a place of understanding, unity, and shared humanity. As the sun began to set, the leader gestured toward the horizon, indicating that it was time for the cowboy to rest. He offered a place among the warriors, a small clearing where a fire had been prepared. The cowboy accepted, feeling the warmth of their hospitality and the weight of their respect. The woman settled nearby, tending to the horse and offering quiet words of thanks. Together they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the plains in shades of gold and purple. The cowboy reflected on the events of the day. He had acted without expectation, driven only by the need to help someone in need. Yet the outcome had been extraordinary. 70 warriors, once strangers, now recognized and honored his courage. The woman he had saved had survived, and through her a bond had been created that would endure far longer than a single day. He understood that compassion, even in its simplest form, could create ripples that transformed lives and communities. Night fell, and the plains were quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. The cowboy sat beside the woman and the warriors, feeling a sense of peace he had never known. The journey had been difficult, filled with fear and uncertainty, but it had also revealed the power of human connection. The plains, which could be harsh and unforgiving, had shown him that courage and kindness could create bonds stronger than fear or prejudice. He thought about his life before this moment, about the long days spent riding alone across the plains. He realized that true courage was not just about surviving the harshness of the land, but about choosing to act with compassion, even when it was risky. The woman, the warriors, and the plains themselves had taught him a lesson he would never forget. That kindness, even in the smallest gestures, could transform lives in ways that were unimaginable. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and respect. She spoke softly, her words a mix of thanks and reassurance. The cowboy nodded, understanding the sentiment even without fully comprehending the language. The connection between them was clear, a bond forged through shared experience, risk, and the quiet courage to act from the heart. The warriors, too, remained close, their presence a reminder of the extraordinary moment that had unfolded. They had come with suspicion and uncertainty, but through observation and understanding they had recognized the truth of the cowboy's actions. The plains, often a place of danger and conflict, had become a place of unity and respect, where human hearts could connect across divides that once seemed insurmountable. As the night deepened, the cowboy finally allowed himself to rest. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the faces of those gathered. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the safety of the woman, but for the lesson he had learned about the power of courage, compassion, and human connection. The plains were vast and often unforgiving, but in that moment they had revealed their capacity for beauty, understanding, and unexpected kindness. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, the cowboy knew that this story was far from over. The bonds that had been formed that day would continue to grow, and the ripples of his actions would extend far beyond what he could see. Courage, he realized, was not always measured in strength or skill. Sometimes it was measured in the willingness to act with compassion when the world seemed harsh and unforgiving. The woman slept nearby, the horse resting beside her, and the warriors kept watch with quiet vigilance. The plains were silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through the grass, a reminder that life continued in its vast, unpredictable rhythm. Yet within that rhythm, moments of extraordinary human connection could emerge, creating stories that would be remembered long after the sun had set. The cowboy's heart was full, not of pride but of quiet understanding. He had acted with courage and compassion, and in doing so, he had changed the course of events in ways he could never have imagined. The plains had taught him a lesson about the power of kindness, about the bonds that could form between strangers, and about the resilience of the human spirit. As the night continued, the fire burned low and the cowboy, the woman, and the warriors rested under the stars. They were united by a single act of courage, a simple gesture of kindness that had transformed fear into respect, danger into trust, and strangers into allies. And in that quiet, still night, the plains held a story that would endure, a story of humanity at its best, and the unthinkable power of compassion. The morning was quiet, the plains stretching endlessly under a soft golden light. The cowboy awoke before sunrise, the air crisp and fresh, carrying the faint scent of wild sage and damp earth. The events of the past 2 days weighed heavily on his mind. He had given his only horse to a wounded woman, and now, somewhere out there, she was moving across the plains on its back, alive because of him. He had never expected the turn his actions would take, and though part of him worried for what might come next, another part felt a deep, quiet pride. The woman, not far from where he sat, had settled near a small grove. Her wounds were sore, but she was stronger now. She tended to the horse, brushing its mane and whispering soothing words. Every movement was slow and careful, yet there was determination in her eyes, a resolve that refused to be broken. She paused occasionally to sip water and adjust the makeshift bandages covering her cuts. She thought of the cowboy and the kindness he had shown her, and she promised herself that she would survive, not just for herself, but to honor the trust he had placed in her. The cowboy went about his morning chores, feeding the animals and checking fences, but his mind kept drifting to her. He knew the plains were full of dangers, wild animals, treacherous terrain, and strangers who might not welcome her. Yet, despite the risks, he believed she had the will to survive. His heart carried a mix of anxiety and hope, an awareness that the outcome of her journey rested on both her strength and the kindness he had extended. By late morning, a distant movement caught his eye. From a far ridge, a large group was approaching. At first he thought it might be travelers or another band of settlers, but the shapes grew clearer and his heart tightened. They were Apache warriors, 70 of them, moving with precision and purpose, their figures framed against the wide open sky. The cowboy's stomach knotted. He was alone, on foot without his horse, surrounded by a group that could easily see him as an enemy. He froze for a moment, assessing the situation. Fear gripped him sharp and cold, but he forced himself to stay calm. He raised his hand slowly, showing that he meant no harm. The warrior's eyes locked on him, scanning every detail of his posture, his movements, his intentions. The tension was almost unbearable, the silence of the plains pressing down like a weight. Then the leader of the group stepped forward. He was an older man, tall and composed, with a presence that demanded attention. He raised a hand in a gesture of peace, and the cowboy's heart beat faster. He didn't understand the language, but the meaning was unmistakable. The warrior's expression was calm, his stance deliberate, signaling that they were not here to attack but to communicate. The cowboy kept his hands raised, taking slow, deliberate steps forward. He could feel the eyes of the 70 warriors on him, yet the tension was shifting. Something in the leader's gaze told him that they were aware of the events that had occurred the day before. The woman, the one he had helped, had told them about him. He realized with a mix of fear and astonishment that the very life he had saved had now connected him to this group in a way he could not have imagined. The warriors began to surround him, moving in a careful, measured way. The cowboy expected hostility, perhaps anger, or even revenge. Instead, he saw something he had not anticipated: respect. The way they positioned themselves, the calm steadiness of their movements, suggested acknowledgement, not aggression. One of them stepped forward with a bundle, placing it on the ground in front of him. The gesture was deliberate, ceremonial. The cowboy bent slightly to inspect the bundle. Inside were supplies, dried meat, a blanket, and small tools of value. The significance of the gifts was clear. These were not just practical items. They were symbols of trust and gratitude, a recognition that his actions the day before had mattered more than he could have known. His chest tightened. He had acted without expectation, simply to help someone in need, and now he was being honored in a way that words could not describe. The woman approached carefully, riding her horse to stand beside him. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and quiet awe. She dismounted slowly, her injuries evident but her spirit unbroken. She looked at the cowboy, then at the warriors, gesturing to show that he was the reason she had survived. The leader nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words, and the cowboy realized that this was more than a moment of thanks. It was a rare, profound recognition of courage and kindness. The warriors formed a loose circle around the three of them, moving with grace and purpose. They bowed slightly, some placing their hands over their hearts, others resting a hand on the ground. The cowboy felt a surge of humility. He had acted from his heart, without thought of reward. And yet the consequences of that single choice were unfolding before him in ways he could scarcely imagine. The woman had survived, and the warriors were honoring that act of selflessness in a way that transcended language or culture. The leader spoke in gestures, pointing toward the horizon, and then toward the cowboy. The meaning was clear. His bravery had strengthened the bond between their people, had created a bridge of trust and respect that did not exist before. The cowboy nodded, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. He had not come seeking recognition, yet here he was, witnessing the power of a simple act of kindness multiplied by courage, gratitude, and honor. Hours passed. The warriors shared their food and water, teaching the cowboy and the woman through gestures and example. He realized that even without understanding their words, the communication was complete. Their respect, their acknowledgement, their gratitude, it was all conveyed through action, expression, and presence. The plains, vast and often unforgiving, had become a stage for an extraordinary human connection, one that neither fear nor hostility could diminish. The woman tended to the horse and herself, her movements careful but steady. She looked at the cowboy with a quiet smile, the kind that spoke of deep gratitude and relief. She gestured toward the warriors, indicating the gifts they had brought and the respect they were showing. The cowboy nodded, understanding the significance of the moment. This was more than survival. This was a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and human connection in a world that often seemed cruel. As the sun began to set, the warriors prepared a small area for the cowboy and the woman to rest. A fire was lit, its warmth spreading across the clearing, casting long shadows over the faces of those gathered. The cowboy and the woman sat near the fire, the horse resting nearby. The warriors remained close, keeping watch and offering quiet gestures of care. The atmosphere was filled with an unusual calm, a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity and trust. The cowboy reflected on the past 2 days. He had acted without expectation, simply to help someone in need. The outcome had been extraordinary. 70 warriors had acknowledged him, not as an enemy but as a person of courage and compassion. The woman he had saved was safe, and through her, a bond had been formed that would endure far longer than the brief encounter on the plains. He understood finally that kindness had a power far greater than he had ever imagined. The night grew colder and the fire burned low. The cowboy, the woman, and the warriors remained near it, listening to the sounds of the plains. Wind rustled through the grass, distant animals called to each other, and above them the stars began to emerge in the clear night sky. Each star seemed to mirror the bonds that had been formed that day, small points of light in a vast expanse, connected by a force that was invisible but undeniable: trust, respect, and shared humanity.